We're going to be in the book of Isaiah this morning, Isaiah chapter 6. And I know preaching on Isaiah 6 is sort of like choosing to comment on the Mona Lisa. It's a passage that is familiar. It's one that many of you probably have had some level of experience with as far as study. I'm sure you've heard a sermon at some point in your life on Isaiah 6 if you've been in the church any length of time. But it's one of those passages that is really shaping for our thoughts about God. And I think sometimes the danger of familiarity creeps in, that we think, oh, I know this one. I know Isaiah. I've been there. That's the one. It's behind me on the wall, right? Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. I know that one. I've got this. I'll just make my to-do list for this week. But let me just remind you, the reason some passages of Scripture are so popular is because they're really good, all right? And let's don't be arrogant this morning and think, oh, I got this, because there's a lot to this passage that I think the Lord will draw out this morning. We're going to try to draw some things together and look at this in maybe a slightly unique way than you have studied in the past. If I say the term Copernican revolution, that will probably ring a bell with many of you. A guy named Copernicus in 1543 published a treatise called On the Revolutions of Heavenly Spheres. A lot of people thought he was crazy because here's what he proposed. He proposed by watching the heavenly bodies, by watching the stars, by looking at the earth. He proposed the earth is not the center of the universe. And people thought he was nuts. Well, other scientists would come behind him. Other evidence would be admitted into the court. And we would find out, particularly when Galileo would come 50 or so years later, 60 years later, we would find that, in fact, the earth is not the center of the universe, but the sun is actually the center of our solar system. And his theory would be proven to be true. And this term, Copernican revolution, has now been adopted in a way where we would say something is Copernican-like, meaning we just shifted the whole paradigm around, okay? That's not at the center anymore. I'm not at the center anymore. And what I would propose this morning needs to happen in some of our lives is that we need to have a little bit of a Copernican revolution in our own hearts and realize I am not at the center of this universe. God is at the center of his universe. The God who spoke these words, the God who is sitting on his throne, is at the center of the universe. We need to recalibrate this morning. We need to recalibrate. We need to reinstall the operating system on some of our hard drives. For those of you who don't do computers, find me later. We'll talk about that. We need to reset, okay? We need to redo. We need to rethink who we are in light of who God is. And I think Isaiah 6 will serve us well this morning to do that. Let me just make a few comments about Isaiah in general. I'm just going to go ahead and lose this, if it's okay with everybody. Thank you. Hear that. Amen. Let me just make a few comments about Isaiah in general, and then I want to make a few specific comments about this context here, and then we will dive into the passage. Isaiah is a great book, okay? If you have never spent some time studying Isaiah, it is a tremendous book, and I would commend it for you for your study. I know our ladies' ministry a couple of years ago, I guess it was, spent a lot of time in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah would have been writing somewhere around 740 or so BC. This would be prior to the fall of the northern kingdom. To put this in the biblical perspective, the biblical timeline, the big picture, the Exodus probably happened somewhere around in the 1440s, okay? Exodus, 1440s. David, Solomon, right around the turn there, around 1000. And so we are a couple hundred years after that, and that's when Isaiah is prophesying. And basically what has happened in the history of Israel, they go in, they take the land, and they have some ups and downs and ups and downs and ups and downs. Really, Israel's at her finest hour under David. And then we see Solomon, his son, come in. He takes the throne. We see he builds the temple that David had planned. The glory of God comes down, and it is glorious scene in Israel. But if you read in 1 Kings, where it tells us all about this, shortly after this glory comes down, we're told that Solomon did not tear down the high places, and he did not stomp out idolatry in Israel. And he would marry all of these women who would pull his heart away, and his kingdom would begin to crumble. And it was under Solomon that the kingdom fractured, the kingdom split, and so now we have the northern kingdom and we have the southern kingdom that is going on, and this is the time when Isaiah fits in. Now, what are the prophets doing? What are they doing? What are these prophecies? And here's basically how the prophets function, okay? You have the history of Israel that's laid out in the historical books, and then you have these prophets who are writing at different times during the history of Israel, and what they're doing is they're looking back, saying, this is what God has done, this is who God is, and they're looking at their present generation, and then they're looking ahead. So there's this constant interplay between looking back at what God has done, looking ahead to what God is going to do, and speaking to the present generation. So that's what the prophets are doing, and that's exactly what we're going to see happen in this text that we're going to look at this morning. As we read the prophets, there are basically two charges that the prophets give. All right, two charges that the prophets give, and that is idolatry of the people. They did not stomp out idolatry. They worshiped other gods, and injustice. They did not treat people the way that God commanded them to treat people. And that's what Isaiah is in a nutshell. It's this prophetic commentary looking at God's promises, looking at the future, and showing Israel how she doesn't measure up to what God has said should happen. So this is the book of Isaiah. Isaiah breaks down really nicely for us. There's a symmetry to it. It's easy to remember. Here's how it goes. First 39 chapters of Isaiah is basically Isaiah pronouncing judgment on the people of Israel. That's basically what's going on. 40 through 66 is basically talking about the restoration that's going to happen. Now that breaks down really nicely for us because our Old Testament canon has how many books? 39. And the New Testament has 27. If you're not good at math, that's 66. Okay? So Isaiah basically parallels the canon, which is just an easy way for us to remember what is going on in this book. Okay? So Isaiah chapter 6, I want to read this entire chapter and then set up a little bit more context, and then we will mine out some truth from this. Okay? Isaiah chapter 6, it says this. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, sitting on a throne high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he flew, and with 2 he covered his feet. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips, your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Then I said, Here am I, send me. And he said, Go and say to the people, Keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull, and their ears heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn and be healed. Then I said, How long, O Lord? And he said, Until cities lie waste without inhabitant and houses without people, and the land is a desolate waste, and the Lord removes people far away. And the forsaken places are many in the midst of the land. And though a tenth remain in it, it will be burned again, like a terebinth or an oak whose stump remains when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump. This is a shocking passage, and I hope that you are able to hear that again this morning with maybe fresh ears to see just how amazing this passage of Scripture really is. So what is going on in the ministry of Isaiah? We are in the midst of dark days. Israel has not been obedient to the Lord. Israel has turned to idolatry. And Isaiah is a prophetic voice that's crying out, turn to your God, stop worshiping these false gods. In the previous chapter, and we're going to look at these in just a moment a little bit closer, what he does is he looks and he calls down woes upon the people. He says, woe are you, woe are you, woe are you. Now, woe, this is not like stopping a horse kind of woe, okay? This is woe, condemnation be upon you. That's what he's saying. So he calls down this condemnation. And he calls it down on Israel, and it's primarily because of her idolatry. Now, idolatry, we were actually speaking about this in our class this morning a little bit. We may not be tempted to make idols in maybe quite the same way that the Israelites were tempted to make. I have not visited with any of you who have in your home a little carved statue sitting in the corner that you bow down to every day. Perhaps that's possible, but that is not dominant in our culture. That would not be typical of us. But just like John Calvin said, the heart is an idol factory. We're always pumping out idols. We're always putting something in front of God. And we need to get a rein on that. And that's what Isaiah is doing, is he's calling down and saying, woe are you, woe are you, woe are you, because you have these idols of your heart. You have these things in front of God. So, he starts out and he gives this historical marker. He says, in the year that King Uzziah died. He gives us a place in time that he's prophesying, and this is how we know roughly where we are. And as we look at this, here's what I want to do. I want to give you 4 points, and these will be very easy to remember. 4 points that will recalibrate our thinking. 4 points recalibrate our thinking. Number 1 is this. We need to look up. We need to look up. You know, the greatest need that you and I have is to see the living God for who he really is. Our greatest need is not necessarily political. It's not social. It's not financial. Our greatest need is to see God for who he is. And this is exactly what God shows Isaiah. We are guilty a lot of times of doing what the French philosopher Voltaire said. He said, God made man in his image, and man returned the favor. We do that, don't we? We make the mistake of what Psalm 50 says, of thinking God is like us. He says, you thought that I was like yourself, but now I rebuke you and I lay the charge before you. It is a massive mistake to think of God as like us. And I think we do this in subtle ways. We think of God just being sort of a 2.0 version of us, just a little bit better version of us. He's like us, but God says, no, I am different. I'm not like you. Don't dumb me down to your level. I am the God who's in the heavens. Don't do that. So let's look at this morning, and we see this look up, and I want to give you just some markers, some things that Isaiah sees about God. What do we see about this God? Well, number 1 is this, that God is alive. Okay? God is alive. It's interesting to notice how this begins. He says, in the year that King Uzziah died, in the year that he died, what did he see? He saw a living God. Uzziah is dead, but God is not. Uzziah is gone, but God is not. Uzziah was basically a good king. He ruled for 52 years, had a long reign. He established some good things. But 2 Chronicles chapter 26 tells us, but when he was strong, this is talking about Uzziah, he grew proud to his destruction. For he was unfaithful to the Lord his God, and entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense of the altar of incense. All right, so Uzziah was basically a good king. He did established some good things in Israel, but his pride got the best of him at the end. And he went into the temple, went to a place where he should not have been, took on a priestly responsibility, and God strikes him with leprosy, and he would die. He would die some years later. Contrasting Uzziah with God. God is alive. He's alive. Think about this. Think about this. We get all excited this time of year. Every 4 years or so, we get really excited about things and who's going to be in charge and who's not going to be in charge. Think about this. In 100 years from now, this planet will be populated by billions of people who are not even born yet. Listen, you're not going to be here. But God, you know where he's still going to be? On his throne. He's still going to be on his throne. God is alive. He's active. We read earlier in Psalm 115, their gods, they're silver and gold. They're going to burn up. They're going to be gone. They're mute. They're deaf. They don't speak. They don't interact. They don't do anything. They just sit there. Our God, he's alive. And he's in the same place that he's been for thousands and thousands and an eternity of time. He's on his throne. God is alive. Take comfort in that today. This was the message that Isaiah needed because he was going through some difficult seasons of ministry, as we'll see in just a little bit. He needed to be reminded, our God is in the heavens. He does what he pleases. He is alive. That's number one. Number two, we're looking up. We're looking up at God. We see that he's alive. Number two, we also see that God is reigning. God is reigning. That's not reign as in R-A-I-N. God is reigning, meaning he's ruling over his creation. Look at where he is. He says, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. Where is he? He's sitting on a throne. He's high and lifted up. We often speak here about the sovereignty of God. And I think it's a wonderful emphasis to have as a church because I think it's an accent that comes through clearly in Scripture. But we need to stop and process that. God is reigning. He's in control. As R.C. Sproul would say, there is not one maverick molecule on planet Earth. He's in control. He doesn't step off his throne to do something else and things get out of order. He's on his throne. He's reigning. It's so interesting that this throne room scene that we have here, when you look at the end in Revelation 4 and John looks up, what does he see? He sees seraphim and he sees God on his throne. And what are they doing? They're saying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. This is 700 and something years later. He's still there. He's reigning. He's ruling. I remember during the 2004 election, I was, at the time, we were in California at Grace Community Church. It was during that time I was completing seminary. And I remember one Sunday, it was right around the election, presidential election. John MacArthur stands up and he says, hey, I want you all to know that I know who's going to win the election. Everybody kind of perked up, said, John MacArthur says it. You just kind of put Selah at the end, right? Pause and meditate. He says, hey, I know who's going to win the election. And he leaned up and he says, God is. And he went on to talk about God's sovereignty, and he referenced things like Romans 13, that God puts their rulers in their places, that they exist because God put them there. We can live in this world. God told these people in the first century to submit to a government that was much worse than ours. God is in control. God is reigning. He's on the throne. Yeah, he has vice regents. He has humans that occupy certain places of authority and leadership here. But don't forget, they are acting according to the predetermined counsel of God. That's all they can do. We are pawns in his game. He is in control. He's in absolute control. So what do we see about God? What's going to reorient our thinking this morning? How do we recalibrate our hearts? You need to look up. You need to see a God who is alive. You need to see a God who's reigning. Next, you need to see a God who is majestic. A God who is majestic. And our words sort of start running out here when we start talking about God because we're trying to describe something that's infinite. And we just kind of get to the end of the road sometimes with our words, really in describing all of these things. God is majestic. Look at this design. Look at what's going on in the temple. And what is God communicating to Isaiah and to us? He says, I saw him. He was on his throne. He was high. He was lifted up. The train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. So you get this image of this majestic throne room scene that's more magnificent than anything we can really put our arms around. Isaiah's looking and just saying, it's like a train's just filling the place. And then there's this smoke, and then the temple thresholds would shake. We'll learn later in the chapter here. And there's this big God, and they're all worshiping him, and everything's about him, and it's majestic, it's huge, it's big. When you stand in the presence of something majestic, what does it do to your heart? No one stands at the edge of the Grand Canyon and turns around to the crowd and says, look at me. Look how great I am. You don't stand at the bottom of Mount Whitney or in the Colorado Rockies and say, check me out. Or at the edge of the Gulf and say, this vast ocean behind me, look at all I've done. No, when you're in the presence of majesty, it turns the equation. It flips it, and you say, I'm humble, I'm small, I'm insignificant. And when we come to the bottom of Mount God and we look up, it reduces us and it puts us in our place. This is what happens to Isaiah. We need a Copernican revolution to happen in our hearts and realize, I'm not that big. I'm not that great. I'm small. That's exactly what happens. This picture shows us this idea of this bigness, this glory. And this is a typical, Isaiah's reaction is very typical of when people encounter God in the Scriptures. And we'll see that in just a moment. So this majesty, glory, transcendence, we just run out of words to really describe it. I'll just say this on this point. Don't limit God to your capacity to understand. He's bigger than you realize. He's bigger than you can hold. If you stand at the edge of the Gulf of Mexico and you have a 5-gallon bucket and you dip it in and say, this is the Gulf of Mexico. It is, but that's not all of it, okay? See, we can know God truly, but we can't know him fully because our minds are limited. Our capacity is limited to fully get it. And Isaiah kind of runs out of things to say here. So, who is this God? Well, he's alive. He's reigning. He's majestic. He's holy. He is holy. Notice this worship that's going back and forth between the seraphim. He describes these guys, and it cross-references nicely with a couple of other passages of Scripture, like Revelation 4 and Ezekiel. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face. With 2 he flew. With 2 he covers his feet. One called to another, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Notice he says that God is a holy, holy, holy God. This would be a Hebrew way of noting a superlative, something that was beyond, something that was great. If you wanted to say something was a big hole, you wouldn't say big hole, you would say it's a hole. All right? It's a big one. That's how they would do it. But this is tripled. This is tripled. He says not only holy, holy, but holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. He's the holiest of all. He's separate, set apart. John Piper, in his sermon on this text, I want to read a portion of this. He says, the possibilities of language to carry the meaning of God eventually run out and spill over to the edge of a world into the vast unknown. Holiness carries us to the brink, and from there on, the experience of God is beyond words. In that same sermon, Piper goes on, get this. What then is holiness? Listen to 3 texts. 1 Samuel 2:2. There is none holy like the Lord. There is none besides thee. Isaiah 40:25. To whom then will you compare me that I should be like him, says the Holy One. Hosea 11:9. I am God and not man, the Holy One in your midst. In the end, God is holy in that he is God and not man. God's holiness is what makes him separate. In fact, that's what the word holiness means. It's a separation from. He's not like us. He's different in his holiness. He's set apart. God exists outside the realm of sin. Next, God is glorious. God is glorious. And this has obviously a lot of crossover with this idea of majesty that we talked about just a few minutes ago. but God is also glorious. God designed an earth to showcase his glory. He made this place the way that he made it so that, Psalm 19, the heavens do what? Declare the glory of God. When you walk outside and you see the sunrise, you think, the heavens declare the glory of God. Don't stop short, by the way, of just saying, wow, isn't that beautiful? Let it take you where it was intended to take you, and that's to a transcendent big God who's majestic. Don't just stop with what a beautiful morning. Stop with what an awesome God to make an earth like this. That's where it needs to take us. That's what it's designed to do. The earth is a showcase for his glory. And one day, Revelation 22, the mission will be complete. God's glory will be fully manifest, where it says there was no sun, there was no moon, because the glory of God provided the light for the nations. God's glory will be on full display at that point. God is glorious. The whole earth is full of his glory. This word glory, it literally means heaviness. It means weightiness. It displaces you. Have you been displaced? Have you been moved by the glory of God? It is a force to be reckoned with. When you come and you wrestle with this concept of God and his glory, you can't stay in the same place. It moves you. And this is exactly where Isaiah goes. I want to jump back into the scene here. So what does Isaiah do? He looks up, he sees this God. How does he respond? How does he respond? And next, so we look up, next we look in. We need to look in at ourselves. In light of who God is, what should that do to my thoughts towards myself? How should I understand this to interface and interact with my life? Well, look at verse 4. He continues this throne room scene. He says, and the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And what did Isaiah do? Man, this is cool. I wish I could stay here all day. Wow, that's neat. Can you do the smoke trick again, God? It's not an appropriate response, is it? To the majesty and the transcendence and the bigness of God. What did he say? He said, woe is me. I am lost. I'm a man of unclean lips. I dwell in the midst of an unclean people. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. He says, I am way out of my league here. God, when I compare myself with other people, I can tend to do okay, don't we? You say, well, yeah, probably shouldn't have done that, but I'm not as bad as him, all right? Yeah, probably wasn't the right thing to say. I may not get dad of the year, but I'm sure a lot better than that guy, right? Maybe I shouldn't have said this. Maybe I shouldn't have done this. Maybe I shouldn't do that, but, you know. It's all relative, right? Well, it's not all relative because we're dealing with a holy God. And we deal with a holy God, he shows us, he shines the light and shows us who we actually are. We are way outclassed here. You ever been in a position where you realize you're the low man on the totem pole at a particular event, and you realize everybody there is smarter than you and faster than you or bigger than you? If you're playing sports, I remember in college playing intramural football. High level intramural football, may I add. And my little team, we won the tournament for our school, and we went to a regional tournament, and we were just a bunch of guys, just kind of having fun. Wasn't too intense. We didn't practice. Just guys going out and playing football. We show up to this tournament, and we pull up, and I look, and I was like, uh-oh, this is going to be a long day. They have uniforms. I was like, uniforms? Not us. They have uniforms. They have plays. They're calling audibles. They got all these sets and stuff. And we're like, we are fixing to get worked. And we did. But we knew immediately, I am completely outclassed here. All right? The level is up here, and I'm down here, and this ain't going to go well. And it didn't. Well, Isaiah has this experience where he says, when I was just living in Israel, I was comfortable looking around and calling down woes on everybody else because my level was just a little bit above them. But now that I'm in the temple and now that I see a holy God who's completely set apart from sin, who's reigning over the universe, I am undone. I am devastated. I'm way out of my league here. That's what he says. He says, woe is me, for I am lost. I'm a man of unclean lips. I dwell in the midst of people of unclean lips. He says, I am ruined by you, God. I hope that you've had that experience in your life where God has ruined you. I hope that you have come face to face with this holy God, and that there was a time in your life where you looked at him and you looked at yourself and said, that's it, I'm undone. I can't stand before you, God. I don't have anything to offer you, God. I hope that has happened in your heart and life. Just to set a little context for what Isaiah says here, I want to just show you a few quick things in chapter 5. Look at, we'll just jump to these quickly. Chapter 5 and verse 8. Notice what he does. He calls down these various woes in chapter 8. He says, woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field, until there is no more room. You're made to dwell alone in the midst of the land. So he's saying, woe to those rich people who buy up all the property and shut out the poor. Woe unto you. Condemnation be upon you. Look at verse 11. Woe to those who rise early in the morning. I wish that verse stopped there, but it doesn't. Woe to those who rise early in the morning, that they may run after strong drink, who tarry late in the evening, as wine inflames them. Woe to you, drunkards, who you get up and the first thing you do is go find your alcohol. Woe be unto you, who stay up late, drinking and partying all the time. Woe upon you. Verse 18. Woe to those who draw iniquity with cords of falsehood, who draw sin as a rope with carts. All right, so he says, woe to those who are constantly involved in iniquity, in falsehood. Look at verse 20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those of you who are turning the tables, who redefine morality and good. Woe be unto you. Verse 21. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and shrewd in their own insight. He's saying, woe to those who are so arrogant and puffed up that you think you don't need anybody else's counsel. You got it all figured out. I got this. Leave me alone. Woe be unto you. Condemnation be upon you. Verse 22. Woe to those who are heroes at drinking wine and valiant men in mixing strong drink, who acquit the guilty for a bribe and deprive the innocent of his right. Woe to those who are known for drinking, carousing, and harboring the guilty. Woe be unto you. Now, with that as a context, come back to Isaiah chapter 5 and in Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 5. And what does he say? When he encounters the living God, he says, woe is me. Woe is me. I'm turning this on myself. For I am lost. I'm a man of unclean lips. I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. He says, I am in trouble. I'm in trouble. In R.C. Sproul's book, The Holiness of God, which I'm sure some of you have read, there's a chapter, and the chapter title is this: The Trauma of Holiness. It's a great chapter title, isn't it? The Trauma of Holiness. And what Sproul does is he walks through these different stories, and he says, here's what happens when people encounter the living God. And he points to passages like Peter, where when Jesus calls him, you know the story in Luke 5, where they've been fishing all night. Jesus says, drop your net on the other side of the boat. They're like, fine, okay, we'll do that. They drop their net, they pull up all these fish, and Peter realizes there's something divine going on here. And Peter's response in Luke 5 and verse 8 is, depart from me, Lord, I am a sinner. God, I'm a sinner. I've got to get away from you. You can't stay in the presence of God, in the holiness, with his holiness, and be a sinner. I've got a problem. I got a massive problem. Well, this is where Isaiah finds himself. There's a holy God. I'm not holy. I can't be here. This is not going to go well. Then, verse 6. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin is atoned for. Now, just try to imagine you're Isaiah, all right? Let's put Isaiah's sandals on for a moment. You're in the throne room. You see this scene. You see this lofty God who's transcendent, lifted up, resplendent, glorious. You see him, and then you see this seraphim, and he takes some tongs, and there's an altar. He takes a coal, and he starts flying towards you. And he's making a beeline towards you with a hot coal, and he's aiming towards your head. How do you think he thought that was going to end? This is not good, man. This is not good. Fire was often associated with judgment in the Bible. And so he thought he was a goner. I'm convinced of that. Isaiah thought, I'm done. This is it. Lord, receive my spirit. This is it. But that's not what happens. He comes down, he touches his lips, and he says, this has touched you, now you're clean. And it is a beautiful picture of what God does with sinners. You see, you need to have this woe is me moment in order for God to come and touch you with the hot coal. You've got to know who you are. You've got to have an awareness of who God is, of your condition before him, and the necessity of Christ and his atoning work to cover your sin. You've got to have that. It's a great picture of the gospel. Have you experienced that in your life? Has God done that? Has he touched you with the coal? Have you had that moment where you realized, I am nothing without God and his grace? Has that happened in your life? So we've seen, we need to look up and see God. We need to look in. We need to see ourselves for who we really are. Then we need to look out. We need to look out. Notice what happens here. All right, so Isaiah has this experience. He sees God. God touches him with the coal. He says, I'm now right. I'm pure. I'm clean. I survived the trauma of holiness. I survived this. And then he hears the Lord saying, verse 8, and I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? All right, so just imagine this scene. God is saying, it doesn't say it's directed towards Isaiah, but he says, we need a messenger. We need somebody to go. You ever volunteered for an assignment without really knowing what the assignment was? You get yourself in all kinds of trouble doing that, right? Hey, will you do me a favor? Sure. Oh no, what did I just volunteer for? Isaiah has a little bit of that moment here. God says, I need a messenger. I need somebody to go. And Isaiah immediately says, count me in. Count me in. You see, when you are right with God, when you understand God and who he is, you understand yourself and you understand what grace has been given to you to have your sin covered, you're willing to go. You're willing to go and do God's work. So what does he tell him to do? He says, okay, here am I, send me. And he said, here's what I want you to do, Isaiah. I want you to go and tell the people this. Look at verse 9, second half. Keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull and their ears heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn and be healed. He says, here's what I want you to do, Isaiah. I want you to go harden the people of Israel. I want you to go, and I want you to preach, and guess what? They're not going to like it a bit, Isaiah. That's what I want you to go do. It's a ministry of hardening. Their ears are going to be heavy. They're not going to see. Their eyes will be blind. Now, Isaiah has a natural response in verse 11. Look at what he says. You could almost feel the emotion of this. Okay. Then he said, how long are we going to do this? How long, O Lord? All right, but this is going to be hard. God, if that's what you want me to do, I'll go do it, but this is going to be a difficult assignment. How long do you think this is going to last? Now, I want to just give you a little bit of context because you're probably thinking right now, that is so unkind of God, right? This is harsh. These are hard things that God's doing. Why is God such a meanie? Why is he sending Isaiah out just to be mocked and slaughtered eventually? Why is he doing this? Well, this message didn't just come out of the blue, and you need to understand that. Remember where we are in the biblical timeline, okay? Exodus, somewhere around 1440s. Isaiah is writing in 700s. So there has been roughly 700 years or so for Israel to stop being idolaters. But they haven't. They haven't. They've been doing it for a long, long, long time. And God is saying, this is it, Isaiah. You're going to be my instrument that's going to bring in this final hardening and this final exile that's going to happen. I want to jump back to Deuteronomy. I just want to show you a couple of things in Deuteronomy that will hopefully shed a little light on this message that he gives Isaiah to say. Deuteronomy chapter 29. And there's multiple places that we could look at in Deuteronomy that talk about this idolatry, talk about this exile that's coming. Because basically what Deuteronomy is, it's kind of Moses' final pregame speech, okay? Moses was not going to be allowed to enter the promised land, but he gives them this final set of sermons, these final instructions saying, Israel, here's what you need to do. And he also says, Israel, you're not going to do it. You're not going to do it. You're going to be exiled. You're going to go to the land. You're going to possess it. You're going to be exiled because of your idolatry and your disobedience. So that is their message that they already have, and we see this coming to fruition. Okay, so with all that as context, look at Deuteronomy chapter 29. We're going to pick up in mid-thought here in verse 24. Deuteronomy 29:24. And he's talking about when this judgment comes. Remember, hundreds of years before, he says, why has the Lord done thus to this land? The nations are going to ask, what is going on with Israel? What caused the heat of his great anger? Then the people will say, it is because they abandoned the covenant of the Lord, the God of their fathers, which he made with them, which he brought them out of the land of Egypt, and went and served other gods and worshipped them, gods whom they had not known and whom he had not allotted to them. Therefore, the anger of the Lord was kindled against this land, bringing upon it all the curses written in this book. And the Lord uprooted them from their land in anger and fury and with great wrath, and he cast them into another land, as they are to this day. Then, verse 29, popular verse. The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law. A lot of times we want to just jump to Deuteronomy 29. We get in a conversation with something like talking about the Trinity. How is God three? How is God one? You say, well, Deuteronomy 29, the secret things belong to God, written things belong to man. I don't know. Which is fine. It's fine. I do it. But understand the context of that passage is Israel is going in to possess a land, and God's not going to let them keep it because they're idolaters. And the nations are going to ask questions about why has it happened this way, and God is saying, those are secret purposes that I have that you are not allowed to see. What a humbling passage. So this is what was prophesied hundreds of years before, and it's now time for God to make good on those promises, and he would use Isaiah as an instrument to do that. So Isaiah is faithful to this ministry, and God would do exactly this. Let me just stop and make a couple of comments about ministry in general and how we would define success in ministry. What is ministry success anyways? Is it packing out the building? Is it a budget? Is it conversions? Those are all fine, good things, right? Those are all good things. Using that paradigm, though, was Isaiah a successful minister? Not very. Was Noah, who preached for 120 years without a convert besides his family, was he successful? No. Was Jeremiah successful? And we could go on and on and on. You see, success in ministry is measured in faithfulness, not in results. It's measured in faithfulness. Are you being faithful to what God has called you to do? You say, well, I just don't know if I can share the gospel with that neighbor again. Yes, you can. You can. You don't know what God is going to do with that. You don't know. I just don't know if I can keep loving this person that's in my life. You can. You can. I just don't know if I can keep showing up to do this. You can. You can do it. God gives us the ability. He gives us the strength. And we don't always get to know exactly what God is going to do with that ministry. And God may very well have you in a place where you are doing ministry, and that ministry is just not going to succeed by a world standards. And that's okay. It's okay. Sometimes, just like Paul said, he got to see some level of success, like with the Corinthians. And he says, you're our letters of commendation. And he was excited to see that, but we're not guaranteed that, right? We're not guaranteed that reality. So, we need to look out. We need to be on mission with God, regardless of what we see. Lastly, I want to give you one more point here, and this will be brief. It's this. We need to look ahead. Okay? We need to look ahead. So, we look up. We see God for who He is. He's holy. He's majestic, transcendent. We look in. We see ourselves. We're broken. We're sinful. We look out. We join God on His mission. And then we need to look ahead. What is God up to? And I just want to try to tie this story in with a bigger theme of the Bible. You know, Jesus actually talked about this very passage of Scripture a couple of different times. And I want to take you to one of those in Matthew chapter 13. Matthew chapter 13. And I want you to turn and look at this because it's significant for our understanding of this passage this morning. Matthew chapter 13. Matthew 13, and beginning in verse 1, Jesus gives them the parable of the soils, okay? And I think most of you would be familiar enough with this story. But there's basically, here's what Jesus says. There's 4 responses that you're going to get to the gospel. You're going to get this one that lies on this seed. The sower goes out. He throws the seed. It's going to land in kind of one of 4 different places. It's going to land like on the road. The birds are going to snatch it up. There's no possible way the seed's going to germinate. That crop's not going to work, okay, if it lands on the road. It lands on the rocky soil, which starts to show some progress, but then there's not enough depth. There's nothing there that can sustain life. Then there's this other one that grows up among the thorns. So it looks okay, but then the thorns, the cares of this world, choke out this look to be spiritual life, but it's not. And then fourth, there's going to be this good soil, the seed that's going to land in the right place, and it's going to produce a crop. And Jesus is telling these stories. And then after he tells the story, in verse 10, look at what happens. Then the disciples came to him and said, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" They said, "Jesus, just say what you mean, man. Why are you telling these stories?" And Jesus says, and he answered them, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand." Do you recognize that language from where we just were in Isaiah? He says, Isaiah, here's what your ministry is going to be. You're going to go, and they're not going to understand, they're not going to see, they're not going to hear. Jesus has an Isaiah-shaped ministry. Look at verse 14. "Indeed, in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, 'You will indeed hear, but never understand. You will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes have closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For truly, I say to you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, and did not see it, and to hear what you hear, and they did not hear it.'" Here's what Jesus says. He says, "I have a ministry that's much like the ministry of Isaiah." And just like Isaiah went And God commissioned him to talk to these people and to teach these people, and they would be hardened and would not respond. So it is with my ministry. There will be many who do not respond to the gospel. I believe the correct interpretation of these soils, these four soils that we see Jesus described, I believe 3 of them are not conversions. They're not true conversions, and there's only one, the one that lasts, the one that's in the good soil, that is a true conversion. He says, I'm going to go do ministry. There's going to be a lot of people that show some sort of partial response, but then they're going to run away. And this is the same thing that happened with Isaiah. And this is why God brought them out. This is why he exiled them. Jesus would use this language again and again with the scribes and Pharisees, talking about you're blind. You are blind guides. You don't hear, you don't understand, you don't perceive. It's Isaiah-like language that he's using to describe this to them. This is the effects of the gospel. For some, it softens. For others, it hardens. That's the reality of it. Go back to Isaiah. I want to make one comment on this final verse, and we will be done. Look at Isaiah chapter 6, the last verse, verse 13. God is explaining his mission to Isaiah, and he says, "And though a tenth remain in it, it will be burned again, like a terebinth or an oak whose stump remains when it is felled." Now, if the verse stopped right there, it would be sad indeed. But this is kind of a microcosm of the book of Isaiah right here. It's this: the holy seed is its stump. There is a seed in the stump. These people are going to be mowed down. But you know what? There's going to come a seed out of that that's going to obey. There's going to come a portion out of that that's going to get it. And ultimately, there would come one seed who would defeat the seed of the serpent. It's the seed of the woman that Genesis 3 talks about. Ultimately, Christ would come out of this. God would preserve his people. He would preserve the messianic line, and Christ would come, and he would be the obedient one. And he would be the one who opens the eyes of the blind. And he would be the one who causes people to hear. And he would be the one who gives hope. Listen, if you have spiritual sight today, if you have spiritual ears to hear, don't be so arrogant as to think you caused that to happen. You're not smarter than everybody else. God has sovereignly worked in your heart to cause you to be able to see, to cause you to be able to hear. And for that, we need to praise him. If you are without Christ this morning, you need to consider these words. You need to consider what Christ said. You need to consider that Christ also said, "Whoever comes unto me, I will not cast him out." If God is working in your heart and life today, don't be dumb. Don't be unresponsive to that work that God is doing in your heart and life today. I'll leave you with a quote from C.S. Lewis, reminding us of the sovereignty of God over all things. He says this: "For you will certainly carry out God's purpose, however you act, but it makes a difference as to whether you will serve like Judas or like John."